to this new podcast series, The Female Trickster. This is part of a wider project called The Other Tricksters. In this series, I interview artists, curators, a clown, performers and dancers, all of them based in Gothenburg, Sweden. This is so I could investigate the trickster element within their work. All of these interviews are very loosely held conversations, with the trickster weaving in and out of them. Each interviewee I invited to make a sound work, which you will hear in the middle of each interview. In the very first podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Annika Lundgren. Annika is an artist, a curator, and in her own words, a vicarious professor. In this one in particular, it felt like Annika was asking me as many questions as I was asking her. So this conversation wanders around an awful lot, but I think we look at the trickster quite a bit in this one, and I thought that would be a nice place to begin this podcast series. So I hope you enjoy it.
But are you looking for the difference between the male and female trickster today? Or do you know what you're looking for?
I think I'm looking for the difference. Mm-hmm. I also think I'm looking for the techniques. Mm-hmm. I want to know this techniques. And I think I'm fascinated in how people survive amongst power. Mm-hmm. In places of power, and how do they survive without having to give up their humour or themselves and become another structure of power. I think in our careers we often have to present something like the performance of the professional or the performance of the, even if it's something as simple as just looking busy. There's many jobs which part of my key function in that job was to look like I was busy.
So being an artist is performing in itself, is that what you say?
I mean
performing the role of the artist.
Performing the role of the artist. There's something we used to call the artist myth, which is sort of performing the role of the artist.
Yes.
I think.
But it does make sense in a lot of ways. I mean, in terms of, for instance, economy.
Yeah.
It's a series of tricks that we have to perform because our economy usually cannot be, cannot be structured or is not structured the way that most other people's are. Or in terms of research, for instance, we're now performing the role of researchers. But what we actually do is still quite unclear or vague or undefined. So maybe in terms of those areas as well, or your CV is a performance. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
The artist talk.
The artist talk, absolutely. I think the artist talk of sort of somehow presenting a career that's flowed continuously from one artwork to another artwork to another artwork.
Yes. I had exactly this experience a while ago when I was doing an artist talk at an art school, and then the teacher afterwards said, but this is also... It's also logic, and you must have really went from, one clear idea to another. And I said it's such a complete misunderstanding. But then because there was all this chaos in between, which is edited out, of course, in the artist talk, where it, partly for good reason, because it's not of interest necessarily to the art students that are listening, all the crazy shit that happened in between, but of course it also makes it look like something that it's not, right?
You put a story on it afterwards. I think.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting with the students, I think, because they sometimes need to know there's this bit in between where you are just sort of like walking through the snow blindly.
Yes, of course. Yeah, we talked about that. Of course, that's important to describe as well when it comes to students, at least, because otherwise they will expect that's what it looks like.
It's just one genius idea after the other, a non-stop creativity flow.
I have on occasion made talks about really crappy work that I've done and why they do not work, and why the idea was, just kind of shit from the start, and why it never amounted to anything. So that's kind of more... But when you make that connection between being an artist and being a trickster, then I think that it's always in relation to the audience that the trickster part comes in, or in relation to the society that the trickster part comes in. Because in the other way, or the other aspect of it is also the truthfulness that you have to have in terms of yourself, or in terms of sincerity when it comes to your own work. So it's really the trickster part really emerges first when you relate to something outside of yourself, right?
I think so. I think especially, and it's always a tricky one being this binary and saying, well, I think in women, but I think it does come out with women because they always have to get round stuff so much. And I think this element of trickster, of getting round the situation, or getting round a problem, or getting round a perception of how they are or how they present themselves into something else. And I think that element is always about dealing with people's perceptions and the audience. And the audience of, I don't know, it could be all sorts of different types of audience, I guess.
So you're saying that the female artists have to negotiate different things than the male artist?
I think so. I think so. I mean, different narratives, maybe. And yeah, I think that they have to negotiate different narratives and therefore have to put a different characteristic onto it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I say that in a bit of a broad way because then I'm going to try and think of and I don't know if I have a perfect example for you. But I mean, there is just these things like on a basic perception of, I guess, prejudice, there's often, generally speaking, more men get to show in galleries than female artists. Just, we still have that narrative running.
But also the persona of the image of the artist. I mean, there is the female artist and the mother, for instance, and motherhood. I mean, those two quite often needs a certain negotiation, in a sense, because the general idea of the artist is someone who is, and I think this is still true, probably, is that it's someone who leads a life that's kind of how do you say? I'm not sure what the right word is, but a rebellious life. Absolutely. Or an anarchist life, or someone who's guided by their whims, by their intuition, by ideas, and motherhood represents the absolute opposite in that sense, which is all about being reliable, being present, being a rock somehow. Exactly, being stable. And also the idea that the artworks are your children. Yes, that's another thing. That I remember an artist saying, well, I couldn't have been an artist if I had had children. And being very kind of, my artworks are my children. And this it's a little surprising in this, was it recently? Or? It was a few years ago. It was Tracy Emin, if you, because she kind of has said, well, yeah, the only people who get to be artists and mothers and parents are men. But it's good to try, I think, to find exactly this path between these two characters. Yeah, because I think there are plenty of parents who are artists, who are women. Yes, I think that's without doubt true. And I think the concept of the artist, and also, I mean, the genius as well, the single genius, completely following their own whims and rebellion and somehow winning over. Yeah, I think the artist does have a lot of trickster characters as well, being clever and outsmarting everything, but trusting their own instincts beyond anything else. And I think that's, that gets a bit, I mean, it feels quite oppressive. this idea of being continuously brilliant and also have fantastic instincts for life. and always look at things from a completely different perspective than anybody else. Yes, so unique. And for a long time I tried to convince my partner that I'm watching Netflix simply because I'm so interested in how a narrative is put together. Or I tried to disguise that as some kind of tool in my work. But I have to admit now that I just watch it, you know. I've come to the self analysis that I did for exactly the same reasons as everybody else. It's just really relaxing to fill your brain with something completely different.
Yeah.
I can get ideas obviously out of it, but it's definitely not a tool in my work. It's
I think I can be quite addicted, I think, to watching TV. I think it's very addictive quality, something about it. But I think I feel like I probably have learnt quite a lot about narrative through watching TV. But I probably don't need to keep on watching it. No. That's the thing. It's like, but because my partner always doesn't quite understand how I can watch things and go, well, that's the murderer, and this is the character, and it's going to be one of these endings to the story, and he was like, well, that's amazing. How did you? And it's like, oh, they're going by a set narrative. I'm not amazing.
It comes from having watched hundreds.
Exactly. Just a lot of hours. Wasn't it something 1,000 hours and you become an expert? So it's more a sign that I have wasted a lot of my time watching TV.
But I was just thinking, just backing up to the part about motherhood and being an artist, though, because there is still something. There is a physicality of it that is different, though. I mean, it's obviously it's clear that after the child is born, there is nothing that father can't do. I mean, it can be, everything can be shared after birth, but up until birth, there is something in that I think is quite interesting as well. That at least affected me a lot. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that it's not all a construction. The idea of motherhood changing you as an artist and as a person.
I think it, I mean, I think that would be kind of impossible to go through. I mean, also you're going for an intense chemical process.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It would be very bizarre if you went through those processes and you didn't have any effect on you.
Yeah. And also, when our child was quite young, he only slept. There was a period of time where he slept for 30 minutes at the time. And then I had to change my practice drastically because I had those 30-minute slots to work with. And then I started to kind of digitalized slideshows with text, imagery and text, which I could, sit and work with in those very short spaces of time that I had. And I think this is probably also something that led up to the fact that I work with text today. So that's interesting, I think.
The circumstances changing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then back to the Trickster again, being a mother also on certain occasions has to be disguised in terms of, for instance, applying for a job or for an exhibition. I mean, there's a Trickster element to that as well. If we go back to that, I was at an interview for a job in Copenhagen while we were living in Berlin, and I couldn't bring our child, which was then only 3 months old, because his passport, it hadn't worked out with his papers.
Yeah.
So I left him with his father in Berlin, which was not a problem in itself. But I came to this interview and sort of pumped out milk. So that was all set, but I forgot about the fact that I would keep producing milk. So I was up for my interview, which was for a job that I really, really wanted. And at the very last minute, I looked down and my entire jacket was like, there were big round stains on it because the breast just keep producing milk.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about this, or it hadn't struck me that would happen. It was the first time I'd, been away from him. So I had to run down to the bathroom and just dry the jacket under this. I had 3 minutes under this heat, and then all this toilet paper down my bra, on with the jacket, walking in, children, not a problem. So, and I just felt how I somehow connected to all the women having gone before me, trying to be more than their bodies in terms of making their way in life in other areas. Or I just felt deeply connected to historical narrative in that particular situation.
And it's very much cleaning up and hiding, isn't it? This function is I'm not tied somehow to my body's function in any way.
Exactly.
I'm somehow beyond that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's an aspect of the trickster that relates to the mother/artist role, in a sense. Yeah. But the role of the trickster is very much connected to who makes the rules, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe that was another thing that fascinated me in terms of playing the part of the illusionist, that the illusionist makes the rules. I'm telling you, now, this is what's going to happen. Or I'm telling you, this is how it's going to be done. There's something about setting down the rules. And rules that are somehow independent from the surrounding society or judicial system. In this room, under those circumstances, those are the rules, and I am the one that makes them. And maybe that's just having an art practice. Maybe that's true for having an art practice in general. But it was somehow underscored by this illusionist role, or very clearly pronounced through what I was doing. I'm going to make this disappear. I'm going to make this emerge. And you can watch it. So there's an element of power in it as well, right?
I think, and what brought me to the Trickster was looking at old folk festivals in different places all over the world, really, at different times, where sort of the rules of society got turned upside down for the day. So the king would become the fool would become the king, or in Native American there was this idea of a sacred clown, and they would descend on the town for one day, and they were kind of funny but scary, and they would sort of mock all the people in power, and but also, you know, the kids would try and play up to them, and then there's stories of them chucking the kids in the river, sort of like, you can play with us, but we also have this edge. But this turning everything upside down, this shift of the power for a temporary period of time. Yes. I think then kind of got sort of put into one person with the trickster, is that they kind of could maybe fool you for a temporary period of time. Scouts are always great. Maybe fool you for like a minute into a whole new set of rules. Yes. And it's a kind of seduction, right? Yeah. Yeah. In my role as the illusionist, it also built on the idea of revealing the mechanisms behind the manifestation, rather than trying to present something impossible. So in a sense, it was an undermining of the illusionist, because I found that interesting too. But there was also this double aspect of it, because it was built up as a magic performance quite dramatically. And then I would, for instance, put a big crystal vase on the podium. I would cover it with a black piece of cloth, and then my assistant would come in with a heavy iron bar, and I would hit it. And then when I removed the cloth, it was broken for obvious reasons. And the audience applauded, as if, and I thought that was quite astonishing to me. Or, you know, in a sense, it was also the setup that made it. But they were quite strong applause. And I was thinking, I wonder why. Why is that? So was it the expectation is it the expectation that needs a release somehow, regardless of what happens? Or was it the relief to see what actually happens? I'm still not quite sure what made people applaud that particular trick so much, but it was very popular. But do you not think some of that is also the expectation of the applause at that moment? Is if you reveal, this is the moment in the magic trick where I would clap. Yes, obviously, yeah. So there's also half of this sort of preparation before. It
was too late to stop. They'd already started.
They've already taken part. The hands are already started going, and then It's a slow realization. Oh no, that wasn't magic.
But that's a really good aspect. That would be great if that's how it was. But maybe the reason why I think those magic tricks are so interesting to talk about in relation to the discussion about the trickster is that it was also an attempt to deconstruct the trick in itself.
Yeah.
Or that was the whole point, so to speak. And it had to do with power. And there was a connection. There was a parallel also, more or less clearly, to the populist politician, for instance, or the politician that like the illusionist has an audience that is willing to believe in the trick. So there was something, it was a critique of the trick, really, as being not magic. And so I'm not sure how that fits into the discussion, but it was such a fantastic concept to work with, the illusionist. There were so many parallels, there were so many ways it could be used somehow to talk about politics or to talk about society or about how human beings interact.
I think this, because it kind of reveals what you were saying earlier, actually, sort of reveals the society illusions, maybe the structures that are kind of illusions as well. And these tricks that sort of we don't even think about, but we've continued to take part into.
Yes, exactly. The internalized.
I think
tricks.
I think these sort of. I sometimes trying to think about etiquette, like given behaviour that we've got into without even thinking about it, and how much can be set off in different directions because we have such given behaviour. I mean, here you go into shops and you look for the number. This is a kind of this given behaviour, or looking for a queue, or and how you could start creating a queue by just standing in a place looking like you're in the beginning of a queue.
And that relates to the manuscript in a sense, doesn't it? That's what I'm working with now, or I'm very interested in the manuscript. And very much for the reasons that you mentioned. What is it? What situations are scripted? What situations are not? What scripts are we not aware of? Exactly what you're talking about. But also the manuscript is something that is both somehow a prediction of something that will happen, or that potentially could happen, and a documentation of something that has happened. So it's also an inquiry into the complexity of time, somehow, if you know what I mean.
And then a given narrative on time, maybe.
Yeah.
Like they're looking back at something.
Yes, exactly.
To write the script.
Exactly, yeah. And what does it mean to leave the script, to divert from the script? And is that even possible?
Måndag. Besiktiga bilen.
Det är något som skakar och vibrerar.
Kultur, medier, trossamfund och fritid.
Alla behövs.
15 miljarder 781 miljoner 531 000 svenska kronor.
Tisdag. Avgift idrottsförening.
Det är något som slamrar som ett tåg.
Samhällsplanering, bostadsförsörjning, byggande samt konsumentpolitik.
Starkare samhälle.
4 miljarder 742 miljoner 123 000 svenska kronor.
Onsdag. Betala fackföreningsavgift.
Det är något som stör och irriterar.
Regional tillväxt.
Full sysselsättning.
3 miljarder 496 miljoner 525 000 svenska kronor.
Torsdag. Byt mobilskärm.
Det är något som stiger som en våg.
Allmän miljö och naturvård.
Stoppa vinstjakten.
9 miljarder 737 miljoner 248 000 svenska kronor.
Fredag. Veckohandla.
Nu blir det bättre. Nu blir det bra.
Energi.
Det gröna folkhemmet.
3 miljarder 149 miljoner 947 000 svenska kronor.
Lördag. Present till mamma.
Och allt vi drömde om i natten ska bli av.
Kommunikationer.
Långsiktiga förutsättningar.
58 miljarder 967 miljoner 655 000 svenska kronor.
Söndag. Köp busskort.
Nu börjar någonting hända.
Areella näringar, landsbygd och livsmedel.
Ett land som håller ihop.
20 miljarder 900 miljoner 281 000 svenska kronor.
Måndag. Beställ tandläkartid.
Nu börjar vinden vända.
Näringsliv.
Arbete åt alla.
7 miljarder 436 miljoner 717 000 svenska kronor.
Tisdag. Betala elräkningen.
Nu börjar pendeln svänga.
Allmänna bidrag till kommuner.
Trygghet för hemmet, frihet för landet.
119 miljarder 992 miljoner 772 000 svenska kronor.
Onsdag. Handla vinterskor.
Nu börjar hoppet tändas.
Statsskuldsräntor.
Ett bättre Sverige för alla.
25 miljarder 155 miljoner 200 000 svenska kronor.
Torsdag. Månadsbelopp studielån.
Nu blir det bättre. Nu blir det bra.
Avgift till EU.
Internationell solidaritet.
40 miljarder 913 miljoner 834 000 svenska kronor.
Fredag. Resa till Örebro.
Och allt vi drömde om i natten ska bli av.
Slutsumma.
1 22 miljarder 551 miljoner 176 000 svenska kronor.
But I was thinking when you were talking before, maybe you could describe to me how you see the male trickster, because I'm not entirely sure that I understand fully what that established concept means.
I mean, so the male trickster, because we have all these classic male tricksters.
Mm-hmm.
So there's Nancy in like old African tales,
Mm-hmm.
who is the storyteller and the spider,
Mm-hmm.
and he weaving stories
Mm-hmm.
in a way, but which is kind of very different to our Greek idea of the spider, but which is Arachne, which was a female. But this Anansi is a weaver of stories, but also a tricks the other animals into there's kind of these stories that I remember being told as a kid about things like how did the rhino get its like wrinkles,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the spider tricking the rhino into sort of scratching his back on this rock
Mm-hmm.
continuously and then eventually his skin wrinkled up, and I think that meant that the spider could get lifts to somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all these sort of stories of creation, but also these stories of like in so if we go into Native American, it's coyote.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm using animals, but they still are always male animals.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of funny trickster stories.
Mm-hmm.
They're the stories of people getting round power,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of tap dancing with power. But they're normally corrupt characters.
There's an element of cheating somehow.
Cheating for sure, but or rewriting the rules for a temporary period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow, sort of in sort of a kind of a stuffy society structure,
Mm-hmm.
they're sort of dancing on the edges,
Mm-hmm.
and normally they're stuck in positions they don't want to necessarily be in,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're trying to work themselves out of it,
Mm-hmm.
but normally they get pushed back into this situation. I guess Loki in the kind of from the Norse gods
Mm-hmm.
is considered a trickster.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of the fool
Mm.
in that would be performing for the king,
The Joker.
the joker, the jester, the fool. So trickster is quite a big, wide thing, but it can be somebody who is a fool themselves, but kind of bizarrely wise at strange moments. Or it can be somebody sort of desperate to gather power and getting round things and manipulation.
But power seems to be a key word for the trickster, gaining power or something.
Gaining
temporarily.
Power. Yeah. If it's temporary gain of power or just, and as I've kind of looked back at female characters normally more just trying to survive. Also the male character is often trying to survive as well. But the female character, it's a little bit more dangerous actually. Their consequences seem more extreme than if the male trickster, they're normally kind of kicked out of town.
But what do you think is the difference today then between the male and the female trickster? Or we were talking about the different consequences. How do you think about that today?
I think I think there's more characters that are coming up now in TV, for instance, what we were talking about earlier, with female characters that I think are quite tricksterish, which is that they are more morally dubious. They are more complicated. We have things like...
and also a little bit mental, right?
Yeah, like not entirely, but get the right to be a bit more complicated. And stories around them. So I guess we have things like, if you've seen Killing Eve.
Yes, fantastic.
Yes,
so good. They're both so good.
They're both so good.
Yeah.
And I think both of them have trickster elements.
Yes, that's true.
So much. There's so much.
Particularly, what's the name?
Villanelle.
Villanelle, yes.
Yeah, I mean the fact that
she's a trickster machine. She's
absolutely and chaos machine.
Yes.
So I mean that's the other aspect is the sort of the dancing on chaos. The chasing of immediacy as well.
And of danger and risk.
Danger and risk. And I think there are all these different types of, so that dubious morals or responsive morals, I think, which is a thing we have only really given to male characters for a long time.
Yeah. So you're saying it's changing and that the trickster role now is becoming more similar?
I don't know about similar, because I think there's still different structures around those characters. But I think they are becoming more visible. And I think that's really interesting. That they're becoming more visible and and I think I'm also slightly obsessed just because I want to know all the tricks. I want to know my way around everything.
Yes. But it also changes the expectation of women, right? I mean, it goes both ways. To see Villanelle in that. I mean, arguably the most violent female mass murderer.
I mean, she's horrendous,
in
right?
film history. Fantastic.
And actually, we should not be rooting for her in any way.
No. It's very hard not to. No.
Yeah, because she's funny and charming and interesting, and that's sort of...
She kills a child. Do you remember that?
Yes, she kills the boy.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, and that's something that I think is amazing, that we managed to, in the story narrative, that you go from that to this and you're still going, okay, and then how's she going to get out of this one?
Yeah, and that's interesting how she gets away with it in terms of the audience.
Yeah.
That we still like her.
Yeah.
Which should be impossible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what that means is that women have more leeway than they thought, or is it that certain women have more leeway, or is it that you have more leeway on certain conditions?
I think we also got to say that, you know, there's probably the leeway's been relaxed because people have pushed it a lot. Yeah, I think half of it is that, you know, these roads have been this idea that you should be traveling down this very restricted route as a woman growing up. has been pushed at quite a lot. So now so maybe that's become very fuzzy to what is your behaviour should be.
Sure, but I mean, it's also true. She's also young, blonde, white, very good looking.
Yes.
And you know, she has all the qualities of a runway model, right?
Yeah.
If this was a middle-aged, overweight black woman, would she still? I mean, it would depend on the script, obviously.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is still, I think, important to underline that. That's another thing. The likability, that there are more and more less likable women. Now I saw Mayor of Easttown with Kate Winslet.
No,
she's so fucking annoying. I mean, she's got very few redeeming characters, and that's also something that's come up over the last 10 years, perhaps. That female characters are allowed to have the center stage and be not likable.
Yes.
And that's that I find very that's a relief, I think.
Yeah,
it opens some doors.
I think it's weirdly a privilege to be able to be unlikable. I think it's weirdly a privilege to be able to be unpleasant. Because this, I guess, to be that person and be allowed to take that space, to be unpleasant and still be allowed to be. Yes. And I guess this is a thing of saying, the traditional tricksters is they had to play these characters and dance on this.
Yes, there was a script for that too.
There was a script and they had to keep on tap dancing between these characters because they had to perform likability. And if they didn't, then there was the possibility of being killed.
Right.
Actually. So this I think is almost like a weird new privilege.
Speaking of tricksters, I'm thinking about the stand-up comedian, or I was thinking about the character, the role. That's another very that's another trickster. Maybe the most dangerous thing you can possibly do, to be up on a stage with the sole aim of making people in the audience laugh.
Yeah.
And that's it must be so terrifying.
Yeah.
And speaking of the female in this context, there is a Swedish stand-up comedian, and once she said, you can be funny to a certain extent and in a specific and in a certain way as a woman, but if you overstep those boundaries, if you are funnier than that, or if you are funny in a way that is not considered feminine, then you have to pay with the way that people look at you, because they will stop seeing you as a woman. So she said there was this very clear line that couldn't be crossed if you wanted to be A, funny, and B, perceived as a woman. And if you crossed that, then you would somehow leave one of those privileges behind. And then you could be as funny as you wanted, but you would never be perceived as attractive as a woman. So she spoke of this choice that she had experienced as a female stand-up comedian, and I thought that was super interesting.
I think that I would kind of love to know where she thought that line was, because I think I kind of can see what she means. I think that's very true, but I think I would love to know what's the moment.
I can't remember if she gave an example, but I imagine that it has to do with joking about sex, perhaps in ways that are being perceived as crude, or in ways that are not tasteful.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is gradually changing with a lot of female stand-ups. But at this point, and it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, she said that that's where those two roads, there was a fork in the road somehow. You could remain a woman, or you could be someone who was hilariously funny, but not feminine.
I think there's a kind of idea of male tricksters, male comedians who get to be considered like a bit genius, a bit so clever, very funny, but so clever, and that the female comedians, stand-up comedians, talk about this not being really somewhere they're allowed to go.
Mm-hmm. But if we looking historically and traditionally at the female position, then you are low on power, low on money, low on physical strength, right?
Yeah.
And low on social influence, political influence.
Absolutely.
So what's left? I mean, that way, what tools do you have left then? Then humor would be one, right? I mean, as a trickster, what other tools could there be in your toolbox when you're denied those other things?
Guile. Survival.
Survival.
Survival isn't a one in your toolbox, but survival methods.
Yes. Social interaction.
Yeah,
perhaps.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think social interaction also means a weird convincing of your tribe to be on your side.
Manipulation.
Yeah, I would say so.
I mean, that has a very bad ring to it. But on the other hand, so has a lot of other things. But manipulation, yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think there's an honestness to talking about manipulation. I think performers play with manipulation. I think we kind of have to, and I'm kind of okay about talking about
It's not necessarily a
manipulation.
bad thing.
No.
No, and for survival, it's necessary.
Yeah.
But maybe in that toolbox is also connected to manipulation, the ability to make people see the world in a different way. So that makes sense then. But that's also part of the trickster, isn't it? In a sense.
In a way, to
make people doubt what they thought was true.
Yeah. But maybe doubt their society's certainty, for sure.
Yeah.
Even if it's temporarily. And but that could lead to something. It could expand, but it's. I think the trickster is going into that not knowing where the end will be.
Yes, but I think the toolbox, the female toolbox, when bereft of a lot of other tools, that's an interesting way of looking at. That's an interesting perspective to look at.
I think
what can you do under those circumstances?
And I think there's so. Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of women who have found themselves, or I guess I was brought up around women who have found themselves maybe without a lot of those social tools. That, being a, respectable female character in society, and therefore having to find different ways around. And I think that's super interesting. What we use, how we get through things.
But obviously another thing is using sexuality as well, right? I mean, that's an obvious... That's the...
the femme fatale classic stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, femme fatale is often seen as the trickster character. But it normally, in storytelling, it always doesn't work out very well for...
No, but there's a moral aspect on it, or at least today there is.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
And the femme fatale, because they, in film, some of the first depictions, I was just reading this a little while ago, the first depictions, she sometimes would get away with it. And then they brought in this code in Hollywood. So she always had to be punished at the end. Right. So they made it part of the storytelling rules that she had to not get away with it. She had to. And in all scary movies, the slutty woman dies first, right?
Yes. And then the black guy, in that order.
Yeah.
All these, at least the 80s, up till the 90s.
80s, the 80s stereotypes of these things. Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting to think of the femme fatale as a trickster, because that's also something that Villanelle uses very much, right?
Yeah.
So what about morality and tricksters?
I think they definitely are amoral characters, or building their own morals. I think the more it's more that I don't know if it's that they're just refusing. But again, I don't know for sure. Each time I'm just going, this is what it is, but it keeps on changing.
Yeah.
Because I think you could say that then maybe they don't have, or they've let go of a piety, or they maybe had some disgust for their society's sense of morals.
Yeah. So there is a rebellion in it.
I think so. Or just a refusal, maybe, to accept that as a justification for behaviour, maybe.
Yeah.
Or they're just playing up because they can.
Or they're playing up because it's the only thing they can.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So maybe it's not necessarily a choice. Maybe it's the only survival skill that's left somehow. But another thing you were talking about is the changing of the rules, which I think is really interesting. As well, I heard this joke at one point about Ulrike Meinhof, which is not, it's not a really funny joke, but it does have, so she dies in prison and then she stands in line in heaven waiting to speak to St. Peter to see if she'll be admitted or not. And she comes up to him and he checks, her CV, and he turns to her and he says, well, I'm sorry, but you're not getting in here. And she says, well, I'm not interested in getting in, but you have 10 minutes to get out. And I really loved that when I heard it the first time. I mean, the more I hear it, the less funny I think it is. But there's something so very radical about refusing the ultimatum somehow. That either this or that. No, I will not. I will choose neither. I have a completely different solution.
I think that's why I keep on bringing it back to artists, because it feels like they keep on trying to find another path to go through. It's not just a depiction of this. It's not just it's somewhere in between. And I think that sort of finding a new path through something is, and probably comes along with a lot of moral dubious behaviour.
Yes, I'm sure it does. Because things have to be tested. I mean, breaking new ground is not easy. I mean, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in a day. There was also this. there was what, as I found, incredibly funny couple of young comedians, and they made a Swedish comedy show called Full Patte. I don't know if you ever saw that. Two quite young sisters, maybe not so young anymore, but they were being funny in exactly that forbidden way that we were talking about earlier. Very crude jokes about sex, body parts, their own and others. Very sexualized language, and enormously funny, but not funny all the time. And that was the thing. A lot of the time it was hilarious, and sometimes the jokes weren't that good. Yeah. And after a while I started perceiving that as that was a decision. That was not a failure. It was I imagine them thinking, well, let's not keep the well-functioning polished jokes. Let's keep all the not so good jokes too. Yeah. Let's keep it all. Yeah. I mean, it. Yeah. I understood it as a choice. They could have edited out those, less successful jokes, but they just kept also the silly and not so great parts. It was I don't know, democratizing relationship to, that's probably not the word, right?
I think, maybe democracy, like democratic
It's
principle
not even a
towards
word. It's not even a word. Democratizing.
I mean, I think I've used it though, so it feels like it should be a word. But
But they were democratic in their relationship to what they came up with. Okay,
Yeah.
let's include this too. It's not that funny, but we're going to keep it.
Yeah, and also maybe,
We don't need to shine at every second. We don't need everything to be badam-tsh.
and also you need to be allowed the listener downtime, I think. Going back to that thing of creating space on when listening. I think those moments where you kind of and then back up and then
creates a rhythm.
Yeah, exactly. I was doing another interview the other day and was talking about how failure. I was talking about how that we probably were not going to be incredible successful artists and make lots of money and do this sort of thing, and that this sort of bizarre decision to keep on doing it, it sort of devies, it's sort of a willful decision over a lot of logic, in a lot of way, and and we were both sort of laughing at this thing of you keep on doing something that perhaps nobody wants.
No, but that's my point. You must want it yourself.
You have to.
You have to.
Yeah.
And I mean, seen from that perspective, it's it's also a privileged situation, provided you can pay the rent and feed your family or whatever the situation is.
Yeah.
But you say, okay, so I'm really interested in this. I think I'm going to look into this. I'm going to spend a lot of time reading about, trying to understand, figuring out, experimenting with this because I really want to know more about it. I mean, seen from that perspective, it's a fantastic thing to spend your time with. And allowing for, visits into other areas, worlds.
I think it's interesting you say that as long as you can pay the rent.
Yes.
And I was thinking about how many times I couldn't pay the rent, but I kept on going on things, and how sort of ridiculous that was to keep on just sort of, ignoring basically
the bills.
but ignoring also what society was saying to me, which is like, you have to do this, and then just keep on going, no, but I want to think about this for a while.
But maybe that's a trickster position as well. The oscillating between various positions in society. Being. It was before I had a family. Obviously, there was more leeway. There was more room to do that. But I remember living in Copenhagen, and I was a dishwasher at the DSB, which is the Danish Railway, in their canteen. So I was doing the dishes, and then I had to ask the afternoon off because I was in an exhibition at Louisiana. So I went there, and the people the artists were celebrated. There was champagne. We were given dinner. We were wined and dined and treated like celebrity. And the next morning at 8:00. I'm right back at the the dishwashing job, where nobody, it's just the woman in the corner, give her the plates. So it's also this, and it's both. I mean, it's really both a quality and a problem, depending on where you're at or what your needs are at a particular moment. But seen as a position of research, it's fantastic, right? To be included, like on all those levels, or to be able to play on all those levels. I mean, when we talk about capitalism, and Franco Berardi speaks about semio-capitalism, for instance, how now the system is, we have become cognitive workers, a lot of us, where we used to offer up our bodies for work, but now it's there is a way of capitalizing off of our dreams, of our thoughts, of our ideas. So that's also something that's changing on a much wider scale. But that kind of leads us into a different and longer discussion.
The discussion today was with Annika Lundgren and me, Danielle Heath. The sound work and editor was Therese Larsson.